next, I'm going to introduce Kelly Osborne. So Kelly is the League's vice president, and I worked with Kelly at the city. She's a great keeper of lists. She's a great researcher. She's a great writer. She's a poet and competent. So here's Kelly.
So, thanks for coming today. Immigration's a knotty debate, an intergenerational claim, and it's our national story. And for some of us, it's a very personal story. So today and March 2018 is a really good time for us as League members, as advocates and civic educators, to have our guest speaker today, Daniel Tichenor. The League has been speaking out forcefully on immigration, particularly in the last couple of years, wonder why. And in units this month, we've been discussing the concept, the history, and the laws related to sanctuary jurisdictions and institutions. So well timed. Daniel Tichenor is the Philip H. Knight Chair of Political Science and Senior Scholar of the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics at the University of Oregon. He's published 7 books, including 3 on immigration: Dividing Lines, The Politics of Immigration Control, The Politics of International Migration, and Immigration Debates. His most recent book, titled Rivalry and Reform, Presidents, Social Movements, and the Transformation of American Politics, will be published by Chicago University Press later this year. And he's received numerous awards for teaching and scholarship, including the Follett Award, the Walker Prize, the Polity Prize, and the Kammerer Award. Dr. Tichenor has provided expert briefings and testimony to Congress on immigration and refugee policy, and his essays on immigration and American politics have appeared in numerous academic journals and popular venues like The Atlantic, The Nation, and The New York Times. And so if you haven't already Googled, once you heard who our speaker was for this month, go ahead and you'll find lots of stuff, and it's a very rewarding read. Just a few more things to say, because he has a very nice background here I want to be sure to share. His research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Eagleton Institute, the John F. Kennedy Foundation, and the Brookings Institution, and in 2016, he was named to the inaugural class of the Andrew Carnegie Fellows, whose scholarship addresses urgent challenges to U.S. democracy and international order. The League is all about U.S. democracy, no? So an ideal speaker today. So if you want to better understand immigration policy and governance, you're in the right place. Please welcome Daniel Tichenor.
Thank you, Kelly and Linda, and it's such a pleasure to join you today. Change of plans. You can always come visit me in my office if you want to see the PowerPoint slides sometime. I can tell you a story. When I first started, Betsy Boyd, my fellow Duck, and started at similar places I did at Rutgers University. When I was a young professor there, they had just installed what they said was smart classroom technology. And so I was a young professor. I came into this hall that looked like the Mojave Desert that could hold 500 students. And I had planned, I was going to be like the Wizard of Oz behind I had all these levers, So I was getting ready to show various clips of films and music and PowerPoint slides and so forth. And I came in the first day and hitting certain buttons and nothing. So I quickly called the IT people, and they came in and they tried to fix it, and after 15 minutes they said it doesn't work. So I thought, okay, well, it didn't work, so I just lectured walking around the classroom, and then the next class I came in again with this polished presentation that was going to be multimedia. It was, straight out of Nike advertisement or whatever. And again, I pushed all the buttons and nothing worked. I called IT and they worked on it for 5 minutes and they said it didn't work. So after that, I just scrapped it all and walked around for the rest of the semester. And at the end of the term, the students, when I got their evaluation, said, "Professor Tichenor is so innovative in his teaching style." So it just goes to show you that, what's been working for hundreds of years is probably the best way to do this. Okay. Oh, well, if it does, great. So what I originally had was to start with is a slide for you, which was just capturing what proportion of the American population was immigrant, was foreign-born from very early. And so what stands out is how dramatically the immigrant population has kind of shaped our country and what the percentages look like. And, in the early 20th century, about 15% of the country's population was foreign-born. And for a long period, we see kind of a fallow period in terms of immigration after World War I. We'll talk more about why that happened in a moment. But then during the last 20 years, you've seen a significant uptick so that we're now at around 12.5% of our population is foreign-born or immigrant. And so we're now, again, approaching the kind of numbers you saw at the turn of the century. And all this is a setup to say that we're a nation of immigrants. But we've always been a very uneasy one. And that is, most Americans identify with immigration in some fashion. Unless you're part of a very small proportion of our population that is Native American, we all have some kind of immigrant past, whether nearer or farther from our own history. And what stands out over the course of the American tradition is that we tend to embrace our immigrant past but dread the immigrant present. So more about that in a minute. But what I wanted to kind of start with is just to say this is an issue that, as you know all too well, is deeply emotional, extremely contentious, and one that's central to the American identity. And what I want to do is basically two main things today. The first is to talk about 4 different perspectives on immigration that's been kind of at the heart of how the American mind has wrestled with this issue. We may think that arguing about this question, debating about it, is brand new. It isn't. We've had these fights from the very founding of the country. So one thing I want to do is kind of give you a sense for 4 different kind of lasting traditions about how we've thought about immigration. And the second thing I want to do is talk about what the implications of these ideas, these kind of interests surrounding immigration have shaped our policies. Now, I tend to approach these things very historically. So in this sense, what I'm going to be talking about today, you should have in mind that the past is prologue. My students know that I love the Mark Twain quote, that history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. So what I'd like to do today is capture some of those rhymes for us, okay? And hopefully leave lots of time for Q&A. But I am a professor, so, occupational hazard. Linda, you can signal to me when I'm going on too long. A good place to start is we think of this issue today as deeply partisan and for good reason. Our 2 parties stand, if you look at whether you want to look at kind of the positions of our last 2 presidents, Obama and Trump, the polls between them on this question, or look at public opinion polls and so forth, we know that you're likely to have one perspective on immigration policy and reform if you're talking to a Republican member. Excellent, brilliant. And a very different one if you're talking to a Democrat. Actually, could you hit return for me? So that was the foreign-born population. Although maybe we hit the ether. I'll just keep going. So one thing I think is extremely helpful. Oh, here it is. Okay, great. Thank you. You've worked wonders. So this is from. Okay. So is it the left or the right? Okay, great. Thanks. So this is just some images from the Obama administration that captures the great divide on this. You may recall during July 4th, during the Central American refugee child crisis, that you had buses being met by Americans who saw them as a threat and stopping the buses. At the same time, there were counter-protests going on saying, you're welcome to America. This is, we want you here. I'm going to hit return, I think. The other. Up right. Okay. Actually, you can keep going. I'm going to fast work. I kind of discussed this a little bit, so when you see one more, there, stop there. That's perfect. Thank you. So we often, again, because of how this issue is often debated, we think about this as a red-blue issue, that is Republicans versus Democrats, left versus right. But if you look at how we've actually debated this issue from the founding, it actually defies that kind of usual red state, blue state, left-right divide that we usually assume. In fact, when you think along two dimensions, one being, what's your relative comfort level in terms of the number of immigrants that ought to come into the country? Do you think we should have broad immigration opportunities and you're comfortable with the robust numbers? Or do you think those numbers should be significantly limited and restricted? Now think of a completely different dimension, and that is immigrant rights. That for those who are not born in this country, what rights ought they have access to? Should those rights be broad? Should the time as a legal permanent resident be relatively brief? Or would you agree with John Adams during the Alien and Sedition Acts and say it should be 2 decades? And so we've had very different opinions about immigration numbers and about immigrant rights. And so what I want to do for the first part of my talk today is just give you some sense for these perspectives. And the first one might seem kind of counterintuitive. It's this one that's labeled egalitarian nationalists, and that is a category in which Americans have thought that we ought to limit the number of immigrants who come into the country, but once here, we ought to extend broad rights. And that might seem like it's counterintuitive. And yet, I'll give you an example of this. So when people up there's Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist who, in the Reconstruction era, complained that every hour sees a newly arrived Irish immigrant take a job from a freed slave. So his concern here is obvious, right? He's worried about what level of economic justice is available to those who are here before we extend opportunities for those who are not. And traditionally, not today, but traditionally, this is where organized labor often fell as well. And likewise, if you want to fast forward, one of my heroes, Barbara Jordan, a congresswoman from Texas, an inspiration, she, for Bill Clinton, served as his kind of chief immigration commission chair. And she also said that before we extend expansive immigration, we ought to make sure that we're protecting the job opportunities and welfare rights of the poorest Americans. Now here's the catch. Douglass and Jordan said, once you're here, you ought to have exactly the same kind of rights as everyone else. Because if you extend permanent gradations, it undercuts democracy and opportunity. And that really goes against the very fabric of the country. And so Douglass, for instance, always was excoriating those of us on the West Coast for how we treated the Chinese. He said, they're experiencing the same kind of terror and oppression that African Americans are throughout this country, okay? So that's one perspective. So to fast forward to another one, sorry, you're taking away from your lunch, but if you could hit return for me. Here's another category, which is one that might be more intuitive, and that is for those who embrace broad immigrant admissions and immigrant rights. And actually, I have a quote from our first president, George Washington, who talks about the notion that the nation ought to extend opportunities not only to the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a full participation of all the rights and privileges. So from the very start, one of the founders who, in his own personal life, was not such an egalitarian, we can talk more about that, but was somebody who expressed these early ideals. And one of my favorite exemplars of this is Jane Addams. How many of you know who Jane Addams is? Okay, so go, this is great. All right, so almost everybody. So when Jane Addams was 29 years old, she and 2 friends established the Whole House settlement in a rough side of Chicago, which principally was serving immigrants from a cross-section, mostly of European nations, especially new European immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also Mexicans and others. And I love this quote from the memoir of one of the Polish immigrants who she served, where she said, The American people still do not quite realize that it was Jane Addams who woke the conscience of America to the debt that it owed to the great masses of people who were pouring into America. It was Jane Addams who pointed out that these immigrants were making the clothing that Americans wore. They knitted the mittens and sweaters to keep American children warm. There was almost no phase of American life in which these immigrants did not serve. We could fast forward to today and make the same kind of argument about the food we consume, right? So Jane Addams was trying to awaken the consciousness of America in the early 20th century, very much in the way that Cesar Chavez was trying to awaken our conscience to this in the 1960s. Okay, and then of course I have John F. Kennedy is famous for his Nation of Immigrants and trying to get into our consciousness this notion that we ought to extend these opportunities. Yeah, thank you. So then we have another perspective on this, which are those who, their comfort level is one of wanting to see immigration numbers restricted, if not stopped altogether, and then want to significantly limit rights. So to unpack this a little bit, I have is a question for you all, which is, so we have a noted political figure who unleashed a blistering attack against new immigrants who he said swarm into our neighborhoods without regard of our laws, customs, and shared values. Why, he asks, should we suffer outsiders who prefer ethnic enclaves where they establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? The painful truth, this commentator adds, is that these newcomers are so culturally different from the rest of us that they will never assimilate like past immigrants, posing a grave threat to the society we cherish. Who is it? And I've already given away it's a he, so I blew that one. And who is he so exercised about? So first part is Germans, okay, and who is it then? You got it. If you hit the side. So you guys are just too smart. Great astute audience. Usually when I ask that from my students, you can imagine who they're usually talking about. They're saying, oh, it's Lou Dobbs complaining about Mexican immigrants. Or they may trot out other things. It may be, we're worried about the Syrian refugees. So basically, this has been with us from the very start. Franklin is very interesting, by the way, because by the time he was actually part of a new American government, in the late 19th century, he had changed his tune and was actively going to Europe, trying to recruit Europeans to come because he had decided it was helpful for the economic development of the country. But at the time, his local candidate had lost in an election in Pennsylvania, so he was really annoyed with the Germans, who he said, are eating that strange food, and, his exact quote is, they're going to Germanize us before we Anglify them. So to me, this is a great caution about how impatient we are with the newest immigrant group. It takes often a long time for people to be fully assimilated, but also points to the fact that we've had, especially for folks in this category, but for many Americans, there's always been a great unease about the stranger who seems like they're the most different from us, when in fact now we think Germans that different from the English and the Irish and so forth. But from their own perspective, it seemed like it was a great divide. If I can, yeah, thank you. So I love this cartoon. You can take that in for a moment. It's from Puck, 19th century, and what it's trying to capture is that you have an Irish immigrant trying to unboard from his steamship into American soil, and he's being told no by all of these leaders of American society. And so they're supposed to capture political leaders, captains of industry, and others. And in fact, what you see then, and they're all well-heeled, but behind them is their own immigrant, kind of very modest immigrant past. So if we had time, I could tell you all about the know-nothings and all of these various traditions across our history, but I think most of you know about these sort of different waves of new immigrants and sort of this backlash to it from Americans who are very worried about it. So a final tradition, I couldn't help, does anyone have tickets to Hamilton? If not, well, you can join me. I don't have a small fortune to go. I'm starting with Hamilton on this because one of the other traditions are those who have tended to want to embrace large immigrant numbers for what those immigrants can bring in terms of their labor to the country. but are less keen about extending broad rights, at least immediately. And so Hamilton actually captured this perspective well early on in saying that, basically the colonies that were doing the best, he said, at the front end of our republic were those who brought in immigrants and knew how to use their labor. So from the very beginning, we had kind of this insatiable appetite for these immigrants. And since the Carnegie Foundation has been paying me some money to do my research, I guess I'm being an ingrate. I'm going to pick on Andrew Carnegie for a second, because as he was creating his wealth through his steel fortunes and so forth, he regularly told people on Capitol Hill that immigration was like a golden stream flowing into the country. And what was he talking about? I want their labor. So the idea was that it's a kind of cheap, exploitable labor force that helped enormously. So just some images of immigrant workers over time. And thank you. Have any of you been to Ellis Island before? Okay, so there's one of my favorite quotes from there, and you'll see on the wall, is from an Irish immigrant who arrived in the 1890s, who said, "I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold. And I learned three things when I got here. The first is the streets were not paved with gold. The second is the streets were not paved. And the third is that these people expect me to pave them." Okay? To me, that's like a great encapsulation of our desire for immigrant labor to help with our own development. Thanks. So just to pivot for a moment, so what I want to do for the remainder of the talk is just give you a few examples. I can't capture it all, but to give you a few examples of the flow of immigration policy over time, and how you can see some of these different perspectives rising to the fore in how we've tried to govern immigrant admissions and rights over time. And the first is something that, at least in this region of the country, we should know well, which is Chinese exclusion. So the most significant federal restrictions on immigration, efforts to regulate immigration, was targeted on the Chinese. What really stands out, by the way, is the Chinese were a minuscule portion of all legal immigration to the United States during the 19th century, one of the smallest. But they caught the most attention because they were racially different, religiously different, and when, in particular, starting in California, there was enormous economic distress the state was feeling, popular demagogues pointed the way to find a convenient scapegoat, who were the Chinese. And once California got into the act of anti-Chinese politics, which became a significant grassroots force, by the way. Almost every little town had their own Chinese exclusion league. It spread like wildfire throughout the West and mountain states. And initially, a lot of those states passed laws designed to restrict immigration, but the Supreme Court said, that's Congress. That's the responsibility of Congress, in fact, to regulate immigration. And so what happened is it then got pressed to the national level, where both parties competed with each other to win over the anti-Chinese vote on the West Coast. Why? Because at the time you had a solid South and a solid North, switch parties right now, and so the solid Democratic South, Republican North, and the West were sort of kingmakers in presidential elections. So European immigration becomes the target of immigration restrictionists in the early 20th century, and the policy tool or method used is an interesting one, because they're trying to think about how do we screen out, who are they worried about? Not all European immigrants. So what stands out with the United States, again, when we say we're a nation of immigrants, is that whereas many European countries may regret, and the nativists in those countries may question immigration as a process itself, throughout our history, we've tended to embrace immigration as a virtuous process and raise concerns about the newest immigrants who are using that in a way that seems to pervert what seemed like a very kind of positive force in American society. So similar things going on in the early 20th century. Immigration restrictionists are looking at new Southern Eastern Europeans who are arriving and saying they're very different than the older northern and western ones. In fact, they looked at these newcomers as racially different. So when I say Southern Eastern Europeans, I'm talking about Russian Jews, Hungarians, Poles, Italians, Greeks. I could rattle off the whole list, right? And what stands out is that actually Congress sponsored what was then the most expensive commission report investigation into what effect these new Southern Eastern Europeans were having on the country. And they produced a 42-volume report. How'd you like to read that for light nighttime reading? And one of them was a dictionary of races that was informed by eugenics. In fact, Congress and its two committees on immigration hired eugenics agents as their special experts. And eugenics, if you don't know what that is, was this pseudo-racist science at the time, with measure skulls and make assumptions based on innate qualities of certain people. And they described Southern and Eastern Europeans as being decidedly racially different than previous Northern and Western Europeans. And because of that, they assumed that the best policy solution was a literacy test. Why? Because in their thinking, and the scientists were telling them, well, these new immigrants are, in fact, genetically inferior, innately incapable of the same intelligence of the previous immigrants. So if we have a literacy test, it'll screen out like 95% of these newcomers arriving. Well, what happened was, so that passes finally in 1917, a long story surrounding that, but the short version, it passes in 1917. A lot of it has to do with the First World War and security jitters that are layered upon worries about jobs and worries about race. And what happens after that? By 1920, 21, they're realizing that it's not slowing Southern and Eastern European immigration, and in fact, Southern and Eastern Europeans were passing literacy tests at greater rates than the Northern and Western Europeans. Now, many of us might then say, okay, so maybe this dictionary of races and the eugenics presumptions behind it were flawed. But no, that was not the assumption. They said, well, the reason they're passing it at higher rates is because these governments in Italy and Greece and so forth are giving them cheat sheets to pass the literacy test. So the solution was to create national origins quotas, which explicitly reserved basically around 72% of all visas would be limited to only Northern and Western Europeans. And most of the rest would then be allowed for Southern and Eastern Europeans. And the other thing it did is dramatically lower the ceiling. It limited all immigration from outside the Western Hemisphere to 120,000. Okay, so it's a dramatic decrease in the number of visas. But here's where it gets interesting. So remember the table I gave you with the 2x2, the four different types? Obviously, this kind of policy is at the heart of what those who want to restrict numbers and restrict rights were going to get out of it. But they didn't have enough numbers in Congress and enough support nationwide alone from that group. So they had to basically reach out and create strange bedfellows with those who might agree with them to vote for this, but they had to give something in exchange. And the bribe was, basically, you had various Southern and Western members of Congress who were fine with limiting overseas immigration from Europe, but said, you cannot cut our access to cheap Mexican labor. And so the deal that was cut in 24 and 28 in the legislation was to basically make sure that Western Hemisphere immigration was not touched. And so at the very same time that we were basically closing the gates to overseas immigration, and that's why Ellis Island and Angel Island and places like that are closed, we had the door wide open to Canadian and Mexican immigration, and largely because growers and ranchers and others wanted to have access to that labor. Okay? So, yeah, please. So this is just an example. Hope it's not too small, but of how it, when you have these four different perspectives, whenever you're going to get major immigration reform done in our country's history, it requires strange bedfellows to basically form together in these kind of fleeting majorities to pass it. And that's why we have these kind of significant contradictions in our immigration policy, immigration refugee policies over time. And there's just one of the examples. So once we get into post-World War II, there's a challenge to these national origins quotas. Harry Truman pushed hard to make sure we could provide some relief for displaced persons, for instance. Dwight Eisenhower was equally vociferous in saying that if we're going to win over the hearts and minds of people around the world during our battle with the Soviet Union, we need to have a more generous policy. In particular, we should provide relief for those who are freeing Hungary after the '56 Hungarian Revolution and onward. So from the White House, you got a very internationalist perspective saying, not unlike George Washington, that we have a special obligation to these refugees. And by the way, in this Cold War clash, we get an upper hand by being more generous in our policies. They were resisted by a number of key members of Congress serving on the immigration committees at the time who said, no, 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 these new refugees are threatening to the security of the country. They harbor radical ideologies, and we need to limit this. So that was kind of a tug-of-war that took place. The tug-of-war thing, yeah, if we could. The tug-of-war finally comes to an end in '65. Lyndon Johnson twists arms to make sure that he gets a majority that vote in favor of the Hart-Celler Act, or the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. It dismantles national origins quotas, and in its place, it puts in a new preference system. Interestingly, the original goal, John F. Kennedy, and then followed up by Lyndon Johnson for immigration reform, wanted a new preference system that placed the highest emphasis on individual skill. And in a play on John F. Kennedy's famous inaugural address, Lyndon Johnson said in one of his State of the Union addresses, advocating this reform, we ought not ask what country you're from, but what you can do for our country. And so that was, a direct assault on this national origins quotas approach. What ends up happening is restrictionists in Congress oppose, and so they have to cut a deal. And at the end of the day, Lyndon Johnson says, we'll take a half a loaf rather than none. And the half a loaf was family preferences, which originally they thought was those who were more restrictionists thought what will happen is it will favor the Europeans who have strong family ties. So there was actually kind of this racist intention behind that with the '65 Act. They didn't think extending the vast majority of visas based on family connections was going to work out well for anyone but Europeans. The other thing is that they put a new limit on Western Hemisphere immigration because now there were forces in Congress who worried about, there being too many Mexicans who were coming across the border, okay? So if we fast forward, thanks. The unintended consequences. In fact, what ends up happening with the '65 Act, and thanks to family ties, is you see a dramatic shift in in the kind of the origins of most of our legal immigration. And up until that point, the vast majority of immigrants to the country were from European sources. After that, by the time you hit 1980, 10% of legal immigration was European, and the rest were coming from Latin America and Asia. And actually, probably one of the most progressive laws we never hear about is the 1990 Immigration Act, which for the first time embraced this kind of more diverse immigration coming into the country. Okay. All right, so you can soak in that cartoon for a moment. So one of the things that I think is useful, and probably in your studies and your research, I'm sure you've picked up on the fact that immigration and refugee policy is not one issue. You have to actually break it down into separate parts. And one part you could think about is legal immigration. That migration stream creates its own kind of set of debates and politics. Refugee policy is another one. And the question about undocumented immigrants and porous borders is yet another one. And that really is at the fore of the national agenda when we talk about immigration reform, basically from the '70s onward. So there's a cartoon that's from the '70s, which is kind of capturing the big wink, as often described, surrounding undocumented Mexican immigrants coming to the country. And from that era on, we were throwing lots of money in terms of border control, and at the same time, we're embracing large-scale Mexican immigration, both legal and undocumented, for some time. And since I want to make sure I have lots of time for Q&A, I'll spare you the long story, but one of the things that happens during the 20th century is we have something called the Bracero program, which starts during World War II and is meant to deal with the manpower shortage in the US, but it exists for years and years after because various employers like this access, again, to this cheap, exploitable labor force. And alongside braceros are large numbers of undocumented Mexican workers coming into the country. And what stands out is that the INS, for years and years, usually only would crack down on undocumented farm workers in the US after harvest season. They would never do it during harvest season because otherwise there would be a huge backlash, okay? So the last time we had really significant comprehensive immigration reform was in 1986, at least especially regarding the issue of undocumented immigration. And it was the Immigration Reform and Control Act of '86. And if I gave you a long discussion of this, not only will your eyes glaze over, but some of you may take a little nap right now. So I won't go into great detail, but I'll just mention 4 main components of it, which is, one, were folks who were advocating legalization for what was roughly then around 3 million undocumented immigrants who were living in the shadows of the United States. Folks from this group were clearly in that category of those who favored broad immigrant rights and broad immigrant admissions. Another group called for employer sanctions to penalize those who knowingly hired undocumented immigrants. And they were in that Frederick Douglass category, okay? There was another group that said we needed to create a new farm worker program that looked like the Bracero program. They're in the Alexander Hamilton category. And still others said we need to beef up the Border Patrol and basically have a wall that would span the southern border. Sound familiar? And they were very much in the restrictions category. What ended up happening, actually, is the final version of this ended up being a mashup of all 4 things. And today, when we talk about comprehensive immigration reform, there's different versions of it, but almost invariably it involves these 4 things of something about we need to enhance enforcement and border control. What are we going to do about the undocumented immigrants living in the country? There's legalization. Some kind of questions about guest worker program, and then finally employer sanctions. Maybe during Q&A I can tell you about why each of these ideas has been fraught, both in the past and today, but they also hold up, as the most key elements of potential compromise on this. Okay. Thank you, Kelly. So with a tip of the cap to Samuel Beckett, for those who don't know the play, Godot never arrives. We have been waiting for comprehensive immigration reform for more than 2 decades now. And Congress is deeply divided on this. And to give you a little flavor why, and Kelly, I'm sorry to keep pestering you, but one is to get a sense for the polarization in Congress over time. And the key thing to know about this, and I'll spare you the political science about what the scores actually are measured, but the center are the number of times folks vote together, okay? And so note the year, there's 73, 74. At the tails are those who never vote with a Democrat or Republican. So here's the vital center of people voting a fair amount together in Congress on all sorts of issues, not just immigration, but other issues. Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry. So here's 1997, 98. Okay, and then one more. So this is our dilemma, not just on immigration reform, but a whole host of issues in this country about partisan polarization in Congress. And so, Betsy could tell you great stories about which Democrats and Republicans in Congress used to vote together all the time. Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy were famous for this. Because at the heart of their friendship was compromise on a variety of issues. And sadly, it happens very rarely now. Just something to punctuate with regard to the undocumented population in the country. The vast majority of our undocumented families have mixed legal status, which means that there's really only about a quarter of our families who are undocumented have everyone in the family who arrived without authorization. The vast majority of families will have dad who might be a legal permanent resident, mom who's undocumented, first daughter who's undocumented, a dreamer, second daughter who was born here, and so forth. And so that's also part of the policy conundrum surrounding this. So to end on an optimistic note, talk a little bit about public opinion. So we just saw slides that showed how far apart our congressional leaders are on this issue. If you want to put it on a presidential terms, think about how far apart President Barack Obama and President Donald Trump are on these issues. They'd be off the charts in terms of how big the chasm is between them. And yet most Americans, I think, actually on these issues agree more than you might think. When I go to my gym, there's on the TVs, one side is Fox News, the other side is CNN, and I guess Switzerland is HGTV in the middle, okay? But what's interesting is on this issue is how much we've kind of changed in our opinion and how much I actually think we agree oftentimes more than we think. So if you looked at public opinion polling surrounding immigration questions from the time you could start trusting them in the 40s onward, you could just predict every single poll, regardless who did it, that most Americans said, we need less immigration, and we need less diverse immigration. But there's a key turning point that takes place in the late 90s. And you start to see the American public in their answer to these questions start to say, so this is, do immigrants to this country cause problems or contribute? And the green line is contribute. And you can see how that upticks over time. And then if you could turn to the next one for me. This is whether immigration levels are too high. And so green is they agree with the notion that it's too high. Again, beginning in the late 90s, and whether you're looking at Gallup or Pew or a whole host, USA Today and other polling, you begin to see a significant shift where most Americans actually do not think immigration today is too high. And here's the one that really stands out to me. So when I first started studying this issue, Immigration Reform and Control Act of '86 had just passed. I'm dating myself. And if you looked at the polling, most Americans hated the amnesty program that was part of that legislation. And when people were asked in focus groups and so forth, they said, well, you know, they're jumping in line and they need to wait their turn and play by the rules. And most Americans in huge numbers were opposed to any kind of legalization. And if you look today, in fact, at its lowest end, about 2/3 want to see some kind of legalization solution to this. And there might be debates about the fine points of what the legalization should look like. But I mentioned Dwight Eisenhower before as being a champion of refugee relief, but he's also famous as well for something that had a title that kind of speaks volumes called Operation Wetback in 1954, 56, in which we had mass roundups of Mexican workers, particularly in the Southwest, where they combined, National Guard with local police forces, INS and so forth, and removed over 1 million Mexicans in the country. The problem was a significant portion of them were Mexican-American legal permanent residents. And most Americans are opposed to some kind of similar mass deportation plan today. Most favor some kind of legalization. And that's the most controversial of the policy proposals up there. And so I have one last slide. So since we're League of Women Voters, an emphasis on voting that I think is pretty interesting, and that is oftentimes in these debates, immigrants themselves are viewed as being these passive recipients of policies and so forth, when in fact, from the very beginning, whether it was Irish immigrants when they first arrived being part of party machines and voting actively, to today, immigrants have agency in protests, as you know, but also in voting. And we can no longer talk about the Latinx vote in the country as a sleeping giant, because it's not sleeping. And even slight upticks in the percentage of Latino and other immigrant voters who are showing up are making a big difference in elections around the country. And I'll just give a couple quick examples. So this woman over here is Lorella Prielli, an undocumented immigrant who became part of the Dreamer movement, and with protests. She was the legislative director for a group called United We Dream in Washington, and she was a thorn in the side of Barack Obama from the day he came into office. Because the older, more seasoned immigrant rights activists in Washington said, Lorella, you need to be patient. We've been on this issue for a long time. President Obama is not our enemy, but he wants to do health care first, and we need to wait our turn. And she said, that's ridiculous. And in fact, started protests that really bothered Obama. She mobilized Dreamers. She's the one who came up with the phrase of Obama being the deporter-in-chief. She was called along with the old guard immigrant rights activists to the White House to meet with them. Obama fulminated, and she at one point during their meeting said, what do you think A. Philip Randolph did when he confronted FDR with the original threat of a march on Washington? You know, our job as movement activists is to push you. We're not part of your constituency. And long story short, DACA has a lot to do with what United We Dream and what Lorella Preelli did in kind of mobilizing people. But the story doesn't end there. Because when I interviewed Lorella Preelli during this period, she was a firebrand. She was going to be in the streets. That was her thing. Fast forward, during the 2016 election, she decided to join the Hillary Clinton campaign and became her point person on getting out Latina and Latino votes. And she's now at the ACLU running their immigrant rights operation. But what's fascinating to me is here's somebody who was on the outside, engaged in social movement, protest, and so forth, who then became part of a significant voter mobilization movement, and she now has a seat at the table. And one last thing, I promise to end here because I want to have time for Q&A, is this one graphic over here. Sheriff Joe Arpaio from Maricopa County, Arizona, one of, basically the nation's most anti-immigrant sheriff in the country, and actually, that was his claim to political success, and he would run on that issue constantly and so forth, and he won by huge landslides. The Latina and Latino vote in Maricopa County went up just 10% in the last election, and he loses by 10%. And that's just a fraction of the potential immigrant vote in that county. So again, voting in immigrant agency is also transforming our democracy. So with that, I will stop. Thank you.
So we have time for just a couple.
I'm sorry, I went on way too long. I actually did plan to keep myself brief.
That's okay. So we have about 5 to 10 minutes. So. Let's go
10. I'd like to hear your comments about immigration versus refugee status for the 4 countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua.
Okay. So are you wondering mostly about those specific countries, or so it's Guatemala, Honduras,
El Salvador, and
Nicaragua. Okay. It's interesting because I've just been spending a lot of time looking at the sanctuary movement papers down in Arizona, where folks on that border were deeply invested in the last 2 countries you're describing. And what stands out to me is what a tiny amount of our immigration we reserve for refugees. It's about 6%. But that quote I had from George Washington at the beginning, if you think about, so the political philosopher Michael Walzer says, the most necessitous strangers are refugees. They're the most desperate, those who have the greatest existential threat. So you would think that would be a category that would be far more generous. But in fact, the reality is that, so the short answer to this, since I know we don't have a lot of time, the short answer is our refugee policy, at least for the last century, has always been dictated first by geopolitics. That is, or what Kissinger called realpolitik, which is somebody, so we adhere to the UN definition in theory of a refugee as one who has a well-founded fear of persecution, right? But in reality, a lot depends which regime you're fleeing and whether at that particular time they're a friend or foe of the United States. And so that's at the heart of how we responded with those 4 countries, and I think it goes well beyond just those 4. So I hope that helps get after it. Yeah.
Is there any other history of blatant religious prejudice that was expressed as Trump has done against Muslims?
A great question. And yes, and I'll give you one that will resonate for a lot of folks in the room, which is, you know, late 1930s. There was some initial efforts to try to rescue Jews, to get out of Nazi Germany, and there are proposals that were put in that were making some headway in Congress. And you had some of the greatest stars of the era, you know, actresses and actors, poets, all kinds of artists actually were taking the lead in trying to provide for this rescue. And Eleanor Roosevelt herself threw her weight behind it, but her husband didn't. And the reason was because in Congress, the majority basically said, well, first was charity starts at home, but when they got down to brass tacks, what they really said was that the head of the Immigration Committee at the time said that Jews who were fleeing from Germany held radical political ideologies that were not in keeping with our democratic traditions. And in fact, the State Department was more explicit in its anti-Semitism. So in memos that have been uncovered that were at the time confidential, you had instructions from the head of the Visa Bureau to our consular offices overseas saying, your job is to delay the granting of visas to the Jews. And they were very open in their rationale, and a lot of it was that they described these Jews as being politically radical and dangerous to the country, even though they were desperately fleeing that exact danger. So I think that's a pretty clear connection to the kind of same approach to refugees, and with a very kind of strong religious bent to it. I hope that gets after your question.
How about this question? Now what? Given where we are.
Yeah. And we only have 4 minutes left, right? I mean, the reality, and it goes back to that where we started with these 4 different perspectives. Regardless of what we think might be the ideal immigration reform, what's realistic is that whatever we come up with is going to have to be some kind of grand bargain, sometimes Faustian bargain, across these different categories. That is, you know, some deal is going to have to be made that addresses economic demand for new workers, along with the humanitarian and democratic demand to provide justice to those who are here who don't have full citizenship, along with nervousness about greater control over immigrant entry and feeling like we have a system that works and is efficient and logical. And then, so that's like, you know, the headlines. So it's like, how do you fill in the details around that, right? And I'll give a very specific example, which gets into legal immigration questions. There's a lot of proposals out there these days that say, well, you know, and our president favors dramatic increases in skills-based immigration, emphasizing merit. Remember what I said before? JFK and LBJ started there. They wanted to emphasize individual merit. But what stands out is that in 1990, they made the decision, which I thought was a smart one. Originally, the idea was to look at this as a zero-sum pie. That is, let's decrease keeping families together, family reunification, by increasing merit-based immigration so that we had more STEM workers, science, technology, engineering, math, and so forth. But in 90, actually, 2 of the strange bedfellows, Ted Kennedy and Alan Simpson, said, why does it have to be either or? Can't we actually bring in the most skilled immigrants and also maintain the value of keeping families together, reuniting them? And so their solution was actually to grow the pie. So I would tend to come down on that level. But there are many out there who would, in response to me, say, we need to actually have a decrease, and it should be more of a zero-sum perspective.
Thank you. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yes.
That was great. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that's his name in China.
It's awesome. I love it. Thanks for having me. It's great to join you today.
So the last thing is, remember that there's a basket where you can drop your name tags in on the way out, and our speaker next month is Paul Slovic on his risk research.
Great.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much for having me.
We're, fit in so well with